Commissioner Cohen. It's Brenda Gertner for the First Nations Coalition. And I'm going to pick up from where I left off yesterday with my questions of Mr. Lapointe. On my walk-in through the slush this morning, I remembered a principle that I find useful in the work that I do, and I wanted to share it. If I would, it takes half a second. I learned it first in South America, and it's a principle called AYNI, A-Y-N-I. And it's a principle in which they use in all of their decision-making within their families and within their communities, and much broader within the resources that they work with. And it's a principle of, for everything that they receive from the Creator, they return to the Creator. And I love that word, and I love that concept as a principle or an ethic. And so when I returned to my work here in British Columbia, I began asking questions of the tribes that I work with along the Fraser and otherwise as to how they would interpret that principle and whether that was a fundamental. And they quickly went to the principle of reciprocity as a fundamental in how they relate to the resources and the way that they make wise decisions. And so I just thought that was a useful thing to throw into the mix in our work and share that with all of you. It's a really simple principle, and it actually applies almost always in our day. That's how they taught it to me in South America. And so hopefully today I can, with the benefit of Mr. Lapointe's excellent education principles, give back a little bit to what we're doing today. Mr. Lapointe, we left off with a dialogue around timing assumptions becoming a little less predictable within the in-season time period. And because the Fraser panel has such an important role in season, most of my questions will focus on that as we continue on, but I have some questions about post-season analysis and what happens with that.
Sure.
And I just wanted to ask you to start with a reflection as distinct from anything else. And one of the things that I'm hearing a lot, and Grand Chief Ken Melloway taught me this last week in my discussions with him. He was, of course, at the Fraser panel meetings last week with you. And he reflected on how things have been changing over the last while from that principle of risk aversion or risk adverse. And then we went to precautionary. But we're not really sort of staying with precautionary, really. He finds the word now has become more flexibility. And so we went, his sense of it, and you know how Grand Chief Ken Melloway is, he sometimes gets right to the point, and I thought that was an interesting observation, if nothing else. And so I was going to ask you if you could reflect with us this morning on where you're finding in your work, both in the pre and in the in and in the post-season, that is compelling you as technical staff and otherwise to be more flexible in how you interpret the data and how you work with the data, and then also the flexibility that you're finding is required in the decision makers.
Sure, Brenda, thanks very much. Mr. Commissioner, I had an aha moment this morning. I realized if I just turned the mic slightly, I could actually speak to you. I was finding it quite difficult yesterday to focus on questions and not direct my comments to you, which I realize is hopefully I hadn't made it more difficult for you. First, on just a general pretext of your remarks, all the words you used, depending upon who hears them, can cause certain reactions. If I was to explain what I would interpret to be the impressions that get left by those words, in some folks, flexibility would be interpreted as excuse to go fishing, for example. That would be one observation I would share with you. In some folks, the word precautionary would be interpreted as an excuse not to go fishing, and risk averse might be interpreted as an even better excuse, or a more substantive excuse, I guess. And so in trying to answer your question, then, I'm thinking about the various contexts that these words get interpreted in the various groups that interpret them, and so I'm trying to be, it may take me a few minutes to compose my thoughts because of that.
And if you're more comfortable, think about your work. And
Sure.
think about your work within creating the data, asking the questions of the data,
Sure.
working with the data, all of that which is necessary as part of your work.
Sure.
Start
sure.
there
So,
if that's the most comfortable.
Sure. So in the context of our work, then, I think it's about providing information about all of the potential alternative outcomes, whether it's, well, in particular, focus on run sizes, for example. We try to provide the full range of run sizes. Over the course of my career now, we had a number of different run size models, and they've changed. As recently as 2006, we probably had 4 or 5 different run size models that we're using, and so the way that we approached the information from a run size perspective was to provide the results of all the models. And so you can see in the minutes of different meetings, you'll see a range of model results provided, and we didn't have the capacity in a technical sense to quantify the uncertainty in the models. And maybe I need to help you understand the difference between those two. But so the uncertainty, if you like, up until the last 4 or 5 years was quantified by the range of potential estimates that could result from different assumptions, different scenarios, if you like. More recently, because of the desire and understanding of risk, and this comes a lot from my background with Randall Peterman originally, and then as it's evolved over time and coming into the fisheries world more generally in the literature, we've been trying to focus more on still providing this range of estimates, but also providing some concept of a probability distribution around these outcomes. So not only what does a particular model say given a certain set of assumptions, but what's the likelihood of a particular outcome given the data that you have. And so I spoke yesterday about recruitment of a new staff member to make sure that if folks decided they want to move towards a formal risk assessment type framework, and I'm probably not going to do a very good job of trying to define that for you, but that we would have a tool that would do a comprehensive job of accounting for all the sources of uncertainty. And we're getting really, really close. We've made some incredible strides. There's a number of challenges that are associated with that. Technically, there's challenges, for sure. You need some bright people, and we're very fortunate to have a particular individual who is extremely good in this area. But it's also understanding. And from the last day or so we spent together that communication of concepts like uncertainty, like distributions, it's if you're making a decision about whether to have a fishery or not, the comfort of an experience of folks is to deal with a number.
Huh.
You deal with a number, and everything else falls out. In all the review we went, or in-season data flow, you see the numbers, and you see, okay, how do you define the TAC? Well, it's the total run minus the spawning escapement, minus the management adjustment. It's an arithmetic equation, which all it has is pluses and minuses. And trust me, sometimes even that very simple arithmetic equation can be pretty hard to understand, as I'm sure folks have appreciated in my testimony up until this point. So now what happens if you say, well, there's a 10% chance that the run is 1 million, there's a 50-50 chance that it's going to be bigger or less than 4 million, and there's a 10% chance it could be big as 8 million. How do you take that information? Do you generate a distribution of TACs? And how do you, and all the technical part of that, like generating the distribution of TACs, all that stuff can be worked out relatively simply. It's not trivial. But then you got to communicate it, and you got to have some understanding about what are you going to do with that. The key element that's needed from a policy perspective to move ahead on this is some idea of risk tolerance.
Exactly.
And risk tolerance involves two things. What's the likelihood of something happening, and what's the consequences of that happening? So let's turn our attention just to the consequences side of it, because the likelihood is something that can technically be solved. Now we're back into the discussion we had yesterday about framing the terms of reference for judging the consequences. We talked about it in the context of escapement yesterday. So if everyone had a 100% agreement on the measure of the various consequences, we could make a very significant progress towards defining the risk tolerance. Now bring into that equation the fact that you have different jurisdictions. You have a treaty between the United States and Canada. Each of those would interpret their risks and tolerances differently just because of the nature of the size of their shares, where they fish, all these things. So Well, I have since 2000.
Could you go one step further with me
Sure.
right on that thought?
Sure.
You know the parties that inform each of those parties. And within each of those parties, there's different measures
Yes.
of risk tolerance
Absolutely,
also.
absolutely.
So there's a
Absolutely.
complexity one step further than
Yeah,
the
I didn't mean to
overview.
stop where I
No,
did.
it's okay. I just want to work with you.
Yeah,
That's fine.
thank you. So, beginning around 2004 or so, I started to just try to get the panel thinking about probabilities, okay? And I did a few presentations, and the goal was just to see if I could make some headway on the educational side of things. And it wasn't agenda-driven. It wasn't like, you shall develop, risk assessment procedures, and trust me, I can show you how to do it type thing. You know by now, from the time you spent with me, I hope that that's not who I am, and it's not certainly not an appropriate role for me in my function in my job. But it's challenging. It's really challenging. And Randall has come to talk to us, because I know Randall is an excellent communicator. He's come and talked to the technical committee and the Fraser panel about uncertainty and risk. And so who better than one of the best people on the West Coast to start getting folks to embrace it? But I think the crux of the issue is that it's the complexity of understanding and the complexity of the players, of all the players, the jurisdictional players, that makes it a very formidable challenge. I've not, given up in terms of my role to communicate. We're still working hard. We're developing some new tools now that we have the run size models that quantify those probabilities. But I do have to admit that it's a fair amount of effort to do this, and if there isn't strong policy direction on whether it's going to be used or not, sometimes I ask myself whether why I'm spending so much time building this tool, because I don't know where it's going to go. Not that I'm an outcome-driven person. I am definitely a process-driven person because I have to be in my job, but I don't see a clear endpoint. I don't know where it's going. And so you sit there and ask yourself, well, I'm spinning my wheels in the mud here, and I'm pushing hard, and it's taking a lot of work, and where's it going? And so there's an element of that with respect to this topic that, us as a staff can only, do our part, our little part of it. And there's a bunch of other parts that have to be done by folks with other responsibilities, particularly on the policy side. So, gentle nudges and opportunities, providing opportunities are kind of the role that I see us playing. But beyond that, it starts to get into kind of outside the role, I think.
Okay. I'm just going to, you've said a lot, and I'm just going to work with a couple of them. One of those is that I heard you give amazingly useful examples of where, as technical staff, you're measuring uncertainties and risks within the data,
right.
And you're also making decisions about which ones you're going to run and for what purposes. That's just the nature of your work, and those are informed by either questions you receive from either of the parties or your own technical work, but those are all decision-making
Sure.
that's
Sure.
being done at the technical level, and that as it's at the technical level, then you're challenged to respond to the complex team that you're working with. And I'm going to keep going with that in a number of ways.
Okay.
So let me just now take you briefly to the preseason, and I would like if Ben could bring forward document 13 on our First Nations Coalition list, and that's a summary article by someone you've spoken of quite a bit, Dr. Randall Peterman. And as I understand your evidence, and I think is clear, is that he is a very useful communicator and very informed on forecasting and forecasting models. Would you agree with me on that?
Last night, I heard Randall speak at the Vancouver Aquarium, where he received the Murray A. Newman Award for Education and Scientific Excellence, and he gave a presentation which actually contains some of these slides.
Oh, well, good. A collective consciousness at work, shall we say. Commissioner Cohen, one of the reasons I'm bringing this forward is not so much that Mr. Lapointe needs it, he clearly doesn't, but I'm going to refer to it as we continue in the work together, because I describe it as a layman's approach to preseason work, and I think, again, you're familiar with this presentation, are you, Mr. Lapointe?
Randall has a gift.
And so I want to turn you first to page 11 of that document, and I'm going to go to tab 3. Perhaps we could mark it as an exhibit at this point
Yes,
in time.
thank you. Is there a cover page for this document?
I'm sorry?
Is there a cover page for this document?
The only cover page that I have begins with, can we do preseason forecasting effectively? If not, what can we do instead? Commissioner Cohen, if you would like me to find out where this is published, or I can do that. It was in Ringtail, and
No,
so I just
don't mean to put you in that trouble. I just
Okay.
didn't know if I could personally identify this. So your what is it exactly you're marking as an exhibit?
I'm marking document 13 on our list of documents.
Okay.
It's can number 17837, I believe. And it begins with the title of his presentation called, Can We Do Preseason Forecasting Effectively? If not, what can we do instead? I, when reviewing this document, wasn't clear on its age. I noticed that it came out of somebody's material at the bottom in 2009. Mr. Lapointe, you may know roughly when this was done. If you don't,
He's done this a few times. I think it was at the one of the public meetings of the think tank. It might have been March 2009. So I bet you could find this on the proceedings of the SFU Continuing Studies website.
I'm confident I'm not using it for controversial material. I'm using it so that it can help organize thoughts. And so I'm going to take you to Table 3. And in particular, that is a summary of the various different types of preseason forecasting models that are used. It's on page 11, sorry.
That'll be marked as Exhibit 334.
Thank you. So he's just summarized the various different types of preseason forecasting models. And from your evidence and from this list, I have collected 4 primary ones and have some questions about that.
Sure.
But I just want to start with a factual question, which is, for the models that he's listed there, is our model in there in any particular number, or are we actually using a hybrid of many of these where we have that information? I'm just trying to understand that part.
I think you're going to have someone come to talk to the forecasting, and I'm a little bit, I can answer your question, okay, but I just want to make the commissioner aware that there may be a presentation on preseason forecasting, and preseason forecasting is the responsibility of TFO, but because I've been
Let's
involved...
stay strategic.
No, I understand, but I just think that sometimes I feel like I'm saying things that someone's going to say in another 3 days, and maybe that's okay in terms of this context. So the way that the forecasts work is that there's a whole suite of models. There's probably... This is probably a pretty good list. I think all of these would be used in Fraser sockeye. There would be some variation depending upon the particular stock. For example, juvenile data isn't available for all the stocks. The sibling models is kind of an interesting one, and I suspect this paper that you brought up has some information about it. It's the idea that if you have different age classes and you have an age class like an age 3 age class that returns the year before the age 4s, you can use the prior year age 3s to forecast the next year's age 4s. That was actually a very, very good method for Fraser sockeye. These age 3 fish are typically called jacks. There's also some Jills, just for the sake of letting people know. But the proportion of those jacks has decreased dramatically, and so those models have deteriorated in their capacity. Interestingly enough, another benefit to the Alaska situation that we talked about yesterday is they have a lot of different siblings to choose from, which gives them an advantage on the forecast side. Although I suspect you'll see in this paper, he'll show that the forecast performance of Alaska and British Columbia salmon forecasters is about the same. I don't know if equally good or equally bad is the correct way to describe it, but they're pretty much the same. So the way it works is there's a suite of models. Each of those models is fit to the data. There is something called a retrospective analysis that's done that compares, that kind of asks the question conceptually, if I'd used this model in 1962, how would it have forecast the 1962 run, and so forth, going through in a sequence. So when I talked yesterday about how the best model is chosen, it's the model that performs best in that sort of hindsight analysis. And
So-
one model of all the suite that are evaluated is chosen typically to make the forecast based
One
on
model for all of them?
one model for each stock. This analysis is done for each of the 19 stocks.
Okay.
And the best model for each stock, one model for each stock is chosen as the best model, and that's used in the forecast. It isn't a person who chooses it, it's the statistics that defines it. In other
So
words,
it's work
there's
of
a
the PSC
statistic.
technical staff?
It's DFO staff that
DFO.
conduct this.
Okay, so is this
that-
now the work that goes into Frizzy? Sorry, I'm not getting it. No, it's not.
This is part of our preseason planning. Canada has a responsibility to do the preseason forecast before any in-season data is collected. We receive those forecasts from Canada, and I'm just describing the methodology used to select the best model.
Okay, I'm going to keep going then.
Okay.
We will have more people giving us more details on this.
If I can just clarify, we will have the modeler who does the preseason forecast modeling here to explain all the detail of how it's done.
I'll
So,
stop.
Yeah.
All right. The place where I was going to go with this list and is to then say we take those different technical things. There's staff that you're not within DFO that does this. The whole goal in the preseason work, once it gets to managers, perhaps, is to help prepare, I heard you say, help prepare decision makers in in-season complexities to consider all the options. Helps to set the minimum target escapements and before we get into the in-season complexities to some extent. And it helps to reduce some concerns that may have been worked out amongst the parties by projecting into the future what are possibilities, so you don't have to work out all the details in season.
Yeah, I think the best word I would use or two words would be contingency planning. I think that's the idea is that it defines a range of potential returns for contingency planning. So, for example,
Can I just go one more step
Sure,
further before?
sure.
And it helps harvesters and fishers to prepare for the season ahead, perhaps.
yeah, I mean, I think processors, for example, are quite interested in potentially the number of cans they might need to purchase going into a coming year. Fishermen might want to know the likelihood of the fact that they have an old net. If they're going to only fish for a day, maybe they just want to fish the old net. If they think they get a lot of fishing, they might want to fix their net. So it does impact investment decisions that have to be made prior to the season about, potential probabilities of outcomes.
And if I understood your evidence to date, one of the challenges associated with that is that typically you're using numbers to explain those options. More and more of those numbers are becoming challenging to rely upon or potentially dangerous to rely upon. And so how much help do the harvesters of Fraser River sockeye within the migratory routes of BC and Washington need that fourth item anymore?
You have to put that question to them. I do get phone calls occasionally from processors saying, I haven't seen the forecast yet, Mike, but what do you think? And that may be used to drive some decisions about the number of cans they buy and so forth. So it's clearly been understood, and perhaps there's less confidence now than there was 25 years ago that fishermen live this every year, right? So they have experienced the uncertainty. They understand that when a forecast is made, that they can't necessarily bank on it. And I would not be surprised if the confidence or the impression about that has changed in this period of declining productivity, because we have seen a number of years in a row where the run has been less than forecast. So if you're a fisherman, you might consider that to be all of us would consider it to be a disappointment. Fishermen might consider it disappointment in a different way. So maybe now fishermen are more skeptical than they were in the past, but they are not surprised by a situation where a run size forecast point estimate doesn't materialize. And in the last probably close to 15 years, what's the year, 2011? 15, easily 15 years, those forecasts have been presented as probability distributions, distributed so with a very broad recognition. I mean, you probably have tables on Ringtail you can pull up, but there's a pretty wide range of potential outcomes. And so not only are fishermen used to it from their personal experience, but they're being reminded of it every year when they see the forecast now that, hey, could be this, could be that. So there's no lack of understanding in those of us that are involved, including fishermen, user groups, about the uncertainty that's associated with preseason forecasts.
All right, then I'm going to now then take you to table 5 of that document of Mr. Peterman's, and that's at page 16. And he's done, again, a useful layman's summary for implications of errors within the preseason forecasts and some suggestions on what we might do in relation to those. And I'm going to have you just briefly review those and see whether you'll agree with them, and then I'm going to turn you to a couple of them. Particularly getting your assessment of where you think we're at in the work that Mr. Peterman has succinctly summarized there for us. How are we doing in improving the in-season monitoring and the updating of forecasts and linking that to decisions that are being made?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great list. I agree with every one of them. And the first one, of course, is kind of in my alley. And so you might think that I'm kind of defending my empire, so to speak. But this is exactly where I would focus the energy. And
is it number one?
Is it number one?
All right.
Absolutely.
But he goes to 6 more places. And
and I'm not trying to suggest that those others aren't
no, but I'm going to
important,
ask.
but I don't think there's an accident of the order that he's listed them here.
Thank you. Great. And again, it's not a criticism. What I was going to next was this improving the monitoring of ocean environments. As I understand, the evidence Commissioner Cohen has heard, there is a growing trend to ensuring that our work is in river and at the mouth is complemented with increasing knowledge about the ocean environment. And he lists that as second. Would you also agree that that would be a useful next area of priority for understanding more of the information, or gaining more of the information we need?
I would agree, but I would provide a bit of a context, and this is where I may disagree with some of my colleagues, I'm not sure, but there's a tremendous value on the understanding side to doing oceanographic research, no doubt about it, particularly in the context of a changing ocean. But the challenge, if we want to link the study of the ocean to improving our forecasts, which is quite often the link that's made. In other words, this is a document about preseason forecasts, and here's a list of things that we should do, is the complexity of trying to link understanding of the ocean to improvements in forecasting. Right now, and this may even be a slide that's in this presentation, I'm not sure, it was a slide certainly that Randall presented last night, about 2/3 of the variation in returns cannot be explained, is unexplainable by the information we have in that list of models that you showed me initially. About 2/3 of it can't be explained. So there's certainly a lot of room to improve, no doubt about it. I mean, 1/3, and the interesting thing about this, or maybe it's the kind of somewhat depressing thing about that, that's if you knew historically what the best model was in each of the years. So Randall did a very large grant and said if we'd known what the best model was for predicting 1962 and we'd picked that one, we could explain about 30%, which means about 2/3 of it is not explainable. So coming back to this ocean monitoring thing, and this may be an unfair comment for me to make because I'm not an oceanographer, but I think that the benefit of the ocean study is more on the knowledge side, and I would be quite skeptical about the likelihood of being able to take that 2/3 that we currently don't understand and shrink it substantially by going out into the ocean. And the reason should be somewhat self-evident, but think about all the events in a fish's life from the day it leaves the mouth of the Fraser River as a fish that's about 80 millimeters or 2.5 inches long in the case of a Fraser sockeye, makes its way into the Strait of Georgia, swims up most of the time through Johnston Straits, ends up something like 25 kilometers away from the mouth of the river, swims around in the Gulf of Alaska for a year or two, swims all the way back 2,500 kilometers, and ask yourself whether you think there's a high prospect of developing some sort of a mathematical model that explains, given if 100 of those guys left the mouth of the Fraser River, how many do you think would come back? You remember the presentation I gave at the very beginning, Exhibit 1, and I provided an example for you of the ratio of the best year and the worst year for Choco sockeye. The worst year was 2009, not too surprisingly, where 3 out of every one of those 1,000 smolts that left Choco Lake, not reached the mouth of the river, we don't have that number, made it back. The best year, almost 24 out of 100 made it back. And I made that point that that ratio is about a factor of 100. That's the amount of variation we've seen in just the last 50 years, and I say just because you got to take kind of a long-term view here, in just one stock in its relative survival in the ocean. So what we're trying to do is explain something that could vary by a factor of 100 by building some sort of model that explains each of the events in that little fish's life over that broad spatial area. And just think about the logistics of conducting a research program. I mean, you can talk to folks who work on the high seas about how difficult it is to work on the high seas. So I'm not trying to say don't invest any money in the ocean. That's not my advice. My advice is don't believe that that investment will result in a substantial decrease in the amount of unexplained variation. I think that's it's too much to expect. So I'm sorry if I spent more time in that one than perhaps.
I'm just going to want to ask you, actually, if I could, one observation, which is we can work very hard at a scientific level to run a lot of models, resulting in a lot of data, resulting in a lot of uncertainties and a lot of risks. And eventually where we get to is decision makers who rely on that data. And one of the key important things in ensuring wise decisions is to make sure that the decision makers reflect a balancing of the risks. Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, and so circling right back to the first one then, if I had, just throw out a number, $10 million to invest or something like that, I would invest that, and this is where perhaps I'm not the best person to say this because you could probably accuse me of conflict of interest because this is what I do, right? So be upfront about that. But I would invest it in the in-season monitoring and in the uncertainty side of the equation, because look what in-season monitoring has done for us. Start with the preseason forecast. Yes. Or I guess the way I would put it to you, ask the question, if we started the season with 1.5 million sockeye forecasts for 2009, how would the season have differed? Because what happened was, and I'm not saying we get it right every year, okay, but because we don't, we detected a low run very early. We put, wrong way to say it, only 8% of the run was harvested. 92% of the run was made available for escapement. Ask yourself how the outcome would have been different if we started the season with an estimate of 1.5 million fish. Would it have been 100% of the run that would have been made available for escapement and none of it harvested? How different would the outcome be?
And those are exactly the types of decisions that people are looking at in season when they're beginning to get data, which has a lot of different types of potential interpretations. Is that correct?
Yeah, for
All
sure.
right, so I'm going to take you to a couple examples on that as we go forward. But it is a continuing complex measuring of risks. We have agreement on that, I think, yes?
Absolutely.
One of the ways that I've observed that we're trying to sort of alleviate some of those risks and uncertainties is to begin to develop decision-making guidelines or rules. As I understand it, and we're going to hear much more detail on this, both FRISI and IFMP within Canada's work is beginning to do that. But if I understand the policy and practice report and the information that I think you provide in the evidence, and I want you to speak on this, that has not been done at the Fraser panel level. Is that correct? We don't have in-season decision-making guidelines or rules in any written form at the Fraser panel.
No, we do have rules. So we have a very specific set of rules that relate to the earliest decisions that the Fraser River panel makes, the initial fisheries. And do I have? Don't think I have anything that I can pull up that I can help you understand this, but it relates to what I said yesterday about trying to compare the in-season data to date to what you might have expected under different forecast levels. We have actually a very formal process where we look at three things. We look at the stock proportions in the samples relative to what would have been expected given the preseason data. We look at the relative abundance through the approach areas. And when I say approach areas, I mean through Area 20 in Johnston Straits. And we look at the escapements to date. And we ask the question before we make any decisions about fishing on those earliest fisheries. These are fisheries that are being contemplated before the data is sufficient to provide any credible estimate of abundance that's different, substantially different than the preseason forecast. So you're in kind of a no man's land in terms of your in-season flow. You have just a few pieces. So we picked out the 3 or 4 pieces that we thought we could use to help the panel. And so, for example, if there's a particular stock in the stock proportions that we're expecting that looks particularly weak, then that might be a reason that the panel would say, well, wait a minute, the abundance is there, the escapement to date is there, but one of these stocks is not there, so that's a red flag. Another red flag would be raised if the abundance to date is not yet at the level, and another red flag would be raised if the escapement to date is not the level. So there's a practice. What I'm hearing you say is there's a practice of approaching the information. It's a practice, and it's a well-defined protocol. Like the panel, that's one of the purposes of the preseason model. It defines the context for making the judgment against the in-season data. It's the only thing that we can use, and is used, and it's not, I guess, written down as a formal policy document, but the panel clearly understands that the data has to be consistent with what you were expecting, consistent with a level that could sustain a fishery in order to open a fishery. So that's you characterize as a practice, I guess. I don't know. Maybe it's a bit of semantics. It's definitely a well understood approach, policy guideline that we follow for those early season decisions. I think that's important, and I just wanted Ben, if you could also call up Policy and Practice Report 5. And if you could go to page 96, and I'm just going to see if we need to clarify this. Sure. It may be that the things you are referring to are things that aren't part of the Fraser panel, and maybe that's where we're at. I'm not sure. And I guess that's important for me because that's where the decisions are being made at the in-season, if that's correct? Sure. So, all right. So as I understood paragraph 258, 259, and 260, in particular the last sentence at the end of 259, and if we just need to tweak this, let's tweak it, but let's just make sure we have this correct. I understand Canada and Canada's caucus relies in some ways on the IFMP guidelines, but I'm looking to see where we've got guidelines for the Fraser panel members and how they're going to make decisions in season. And I really do make a distinction between a practice which is built up over time based on the people that have participated till that point in time, and policy guidelines going forward into the future, which have been developed by those that balance risks and certainties in different ways. And as I understand it, we're at we might be what we call having moment in time at the Fraser panel, because
at paragraph 259, there are no strict in-season decision rules for the Fraser River panel, although
So-
through the caucus they adhere to the IFMP. So could you tweak that for us if you need to, or comment on that?
Well, so let me look at it and see if I can help you. All of the FRP decisions, first of all, within Canada, would follow the guidelines of the IFMP. Is that clearly understood? In other words, the Fraser panel is, the Canadian section of the Fraser panel is not independent. It is, in fact, the same individuals in some cases domestically. So there is no distinction between...
Are there guidelines and rules that the panel members representing the United States and Canada collectively use at the
So you're
Fraser
talking about
panel?
bilateral rules.
Absolutely, I'm talking about
So that the
rules
example-
of the panel.
So the example that I gave to you is one example that I would characterize in that sense. In terms of some written set of rules or formal structured decision kind of recipes or something like that, there's nothing like that I'm aware of that kind of formally drives those decisions.
Okay, if Ben, if you could go then back to the other exhibit that we had already opened, and let's go back to Table 5 for a moment. And that was helpful, and we now have that in the evidence to help us with that paragraph. I want to go back to the implications of errors in preseason forecasts, and I just have one more topic on this. And in particular, I want to go to paragraph 6, because it's in which Dr. Peterman says that one of the implications of errors in preseason forecasts are reducing expectations about accuracy of the forecasts. And I thought his comment there was somewhat picked up in what I understood your evidence to be yesterday, that it is difficult to explain uncertainties to the public, to managers, to the media, to the harvesters of the fish. If you're just using the one-pager of all the numbers, those, looking at those numbers often actually requires, as you said this morning, expertise and understanding how to use them. But a number goes a long way pretty quickly. If you say the run's going to be 9 million and the run is actually 2 million, there's a lot of work that has to be done as a result of that. But if you say this is the type of fishery we're anticipating and here are some of the complexities associated with it, that's a different story. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so I think what I tried to describe yesterday when I went through the preseason is that, in fact, the panel, for sure, and I think Canada also separately, and I could perhaps provide an example, uses, well, I shouldn't say Canada separately, Canada in addition would do additional things sometimes because of their context, but uses that uncertainty. Like the uncertainty range defines the set of scenarios that the panel would consider. And for example, because of the last several years of runs being less than forecast, I know in Canada there's been additional work done at even lower run sizes low enough so that the total available Fraser River Aboriginal harvest would not be available, for example. So that if the eventuality happened where the run was so low that the full, for a notional sense, 750,000 was not available, and there was a need for groups to understand how they would share a less than full amount, then that kind of contingency planning gets done, and the probability distribution of the forecast provides some help about the likelihood of that event happening. And I'm not part of those meetings, but I do understand that those kinds of plans get done, and perhaps you're aware of some of them in more detail, so that kind, as I said yesterday, that kind of contingency planning can be started in the winter, in the spring when there's time, and not have to be dealt with in the heat of the moment because you didn't think about that possibility. So, but the challenge, you're right, on the communication side, we need to use better words. We need to perhaps consider some different kinds of pictures there may be lots of different ways we could improve the understanding out there.
I've just got a couple of technical questions that are a little bit less strategic in nature. Sorry, Commissioner Cohen.
Ms. Gertner, I wonder if I could just, and I apologize for interrupting, I just
Please.
want to understand this one point. And I'm not being facetious, Dr. Lapointe, but why is this called a forecast? And the reason I ask that is from the last several days of your description of the process. If I can draw an analogy that some council have to weather forecasting, where you do have satellite images where weather forecasters or scientists or meteorologists can actually visualize what's coming, and subject to a change in wind or something of that nature, they can reasonably say to the user groups, in the next 5 days, or perhaps at the most 10 days, we can tell you this. But you've just told us that you really don't have any information about what's coming. So what does this word forecast mean in your world?
The history is, it's probably comes from the statistical jargon. It's a statistical forecast. That's a prediction. It's not, there was no kind of, well, I don't know when it was first used, but there's no kind of deliberate thought about trying to use a different word, and maybe the choice of a different word would do a better job of conveying that it's not the same as a weather forecast. But it's interesting that you bring that up, and I don't know.
Is it more accurate, if I may, Commissioner Cohen, to actually call it a preseason possibility?
Maybe that would help folks understand it better.
Well, I wasn't trying.
And range of possibilities, because it is actually exactly as you're suggesting.
Well, I wasn't trying to split hairs. I was just thinking in my own mind, as you started to describe the process, that yes, the humans are doing models, but you've indicated to us that the information you have on the ground is almost nothing.
Well, it's the analogy with weather forecasting is excellent. In fact, Randall uses this in his presentation, and I heard him use it again last night. You're exactly right. The public is used to dealing with weather forecasters, and weather forecasters have something like, well, first of all, everyone would understand that once you get 10 days out, weather forecasters get quite nervous about making more than a 10-day forecast. For their 5-day and 10-day forecasts, they probably have 1,000 or more satellite observations, as you say, fairly direct measurements with some predictable understanding of the physics, which they can use to make a forecast. So characterization on the salmon side is that we have a few pieces of data, and we're making a projection that pretty much most of the time is 4 years out. So it's kind of a ratio of two things: the observational data set that you have and the amount of time in advance or into the future you're looking. If a weather forecaster isn't willing to make a more than 10-day forecast, and he's got 1,000 times more pieces of information, why do folks expect, or perhaps you could ask the question, why do we even try, perhaps, but I think there is a value, as I said yesterday. It's not surprising that the public would misperceive the capacity because of their personal experience. So I'm not sure if that's why you brought the weather analogy up, but it is a very good one.
No, thank you. I did bring it up for that purpose because you indicated a few moments ago that, as an example, that a user group may contact you or may look at the information and make decisions about investments. And is that because that's just the way they have to function, or is that because they have a certain degree of reliance upon these forecasts?
I think it's mostly the former, sir. I think that they have to make a decision. You can't order the number of cans you need 10 days before the fish arrive. It's a constraint on the time lag between the process of making that decision, whatever has to happen, and when you may know more about what's going on.
Thank you, Ms. I apologize to interrupt you.
No,
Thank you.
I'd actually like to ask a follow-up question on that, if I may, which is, you keep referring to the processing plants that need the advance warning. And so there's two things that I'm just curious about, which is one, the small bite fisheries that we're beginning to talk about, and the ITQ fisheries, and many of the Aboriginal fisheries are actually fairly easily accessible to the water. They don't need to travel long distances like in Bristol Bay or any of those things. And so the importance of them understanding the risks and is actually much more complex. They need to know what kinds of decisions may get made in season and what they're going to do. They don't really need a guaranteed number ahead of time. Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, and the reason I bring up the processing one is just because it's an example that came to the top of my head.
Well, I think it's important, though. I'm going to go one step further, because cans don't rot. They can be put in a warehouse, and these types of decisions are the kinds of decisions that there is pressure on the industry and there's pressure on the fisheries about. And so I actually would like you to know whether or not it would be more useful for you to be very clear to those that this is, yes, pre-season work. These are the options that we've looked at, and there's a whole bunch of variabilities, and that these are the kinds of decisions and guidelines we're going to use in season. Mm-hmm. Would you agree with me that that's actually a fair picture of the complexity you're juggling?
I'd like to think that we are clear. Like I don't. When the gentleman calls me up and asks me what my take is, I provide a range of possibilities. I don't think, and also the folks that do. And doesn't happen that often. I can probably think of a handful of times it's happened in my career. But when it does happen, the folks that are calling also have lived the many years and they understand. So they're looking for. I might tell him something and he might go off and say, okay, well he said this and this person said that and another person said that. I'm going to do this, and he might only buy half as many or whatever. But in the context of the ITQ, I think. It's a good thing to think about, because now on the economic side of the ITQ, which I didn't talk about yesterday, one of the things that's happening is the catch is being spread over the weeks. And part of the motivation for doing that is to try to have as many of the fish that are harvested go to the fresh market, because you get a higher price for the fresh market. Whereas if you had a fishery that caught 1 million fish on a Monday and all those fish entered the plant, there's all the plant stuff related to that. But there's no way you're going to sell 1 million fish in the fresh market in Vancouver. But if you spread those out over 6, 8, 10 days, then all of a sudden, so there is a change in this sort of storage issue related to this change in the structure of the fisheries. I guess what I'm trying to say.
Okay, and I meant no disrespect to the industry in commenting that cans don't rot. I was just being clear that there are implications associated with these decisions.
Sure.
I'm going to just try to ask a couple of technical questions, and then we'll have another around at a strategic level. I just wanted to understand DBEs and MAs a little bit more before we get into more detail about them. And as I understand it, depending on the year and the particular stock, a DBE has the effect of increasing what we call the final run size. Is that correct?
If it's added to the total run, in the years when it's added to the total run, it does increase the total run relative to not including it.
Are they also then considered 4 years later when you're looking at the MAs? Because you've got fish added that haven't been observed or counted, and then you're going to start making decisions that that was the run size 4 years earlier, and we're now projecting given that run size, what this year is going to be. Do those DBEs then get considered when looking at the pre-season forecast 4 years later and developing the MAs, or are they standalone numbers?
There's no feedback of a decision about a management adjustment on a future year's management adjustment. In other words, the management adjustment doesn't come bigger or smaller in a future year because of some decision you made about a management adjustment in the past year.
So the management adjustment is forward-looking.
The data set for the management adjustments is not affected by whether or not the management adjustment is added to a total return in any particular years. The management adjustments that are in the data set include both positive and negative deviations. Where the feedback is to the forecast, and this may be more the question that you're asking, and so we'll talk and hopefully we figure that out, is that if there's a year when we think there's been an en route loss where we add the DBE to the total run, then in the forecasting sense, the impact is that that total run influences the productivity because the run is bigger, right? So all else being equal.
If those fish got to the spawning grounds, the run will be bigger.
Though the run part of the forecast has got two pieces of information. It's got the number of fish that spawned, which are not impacted by DBEs at all. It's the estimate of number of fish that made it, right?
Yes.
No DBE impact at all. And the number of fish that return from a particular spawning, right? I mean, you have to be able to say, in the past, how many fish on average have returned for a given number of spawners? That's what the forecast analysis is. It's taking all of your historical data, lining up all the parents, abundances in the parents, all the returns in the return years, so they're offset by 4 years, right? Because this spawner from 2006 generates a return in 2010. So parents and offspring, if you like.
I got it, yeah.
Got that? That's the historical data set. So whenever there's a number like a DBE added to the total run, it doesn't affect the parent number. Those number of spawners is the same, but it does affect the return. So your impression about the return in those years where you've added something to it, this DBE, is going to be that it's a larger number than it would have been if you hadn't added that number. So you might then, let's just take a very simple example where you have two data sets, one that's never had a DBE added to it ever, and another one where, say, 100 fish was added every year to the DBE. Okay, two simple examples. One of those data sets would have a different impression about productivity. The one without the DBE would have a much lower impression of productivity, and by productivity I mean the ratio of that return number to the number of parents, than the one that had the 100 added just to the return column, right? If you add 100 to every one of those returns, that ratio is going to be bigger. So that's what we call productivity, that ratio. So the impact on forecasting is then, when we add that DBE for those years, our impression about productivity is that it's higher than it would have been had we not added that number to it. Now, just to complete the story so that we're not, misleading anyone, we are aware that that is the impact of this. The reason that we make a deliberate choice about adding a DBE or not is that we believe by adding it, we're getting a more accurate estimate of the total return than by not adding it. In other words, we don't add it to the total return to give the misimpression of higher productivity. There will be some years where it's not added, right? But because it's, as I said yesterday, an on-off switch, it's either added or it's not, there is this potential implication, which is why I've already spent too much time talking about why I want to attach some more discipline to these decisions, so that we are cognizant of that. And one of the things in this framework that we've been discussing in the tech committee is just the simple task of making it easy for any analyst to do the analysis with or without. Do the analysis both ways and understand how, in other words, do an analysis of both of those data sets, one that has the DB in and one that has it out. That's one of the first objectives that we have in trying to make it simple for folks to understand the implications. So that's the feedback on the forecast, but this feedback with the management adjustment really, it doesn't affect the management adjustment data sets at all.
DBs could give the impression that we are going to get a larger return. You're aware of that, and I just want to know who the "you're" is in that sentence. We are aware of that. Is that PSC staff?
All of the folks that use the data in terms of, particularly the forecasters, those folks on the tech committee are aware of this issue.
So
and
this is particularly a technical analysis that one of those technical practices that are being developed?
Yes, although we don't. We don't work in a vacuum, right? So the Fraser River panel is definitely engaged and aware, and this is one of the reasons why we're kind of focused on this issue right now, is just to make sure there isn't anybody who isn't aware, right? So that there could be no misconceptions about the potential impact on the data flow.
Okay, just a couple more questions. It is one of the places within the numbers that water flow and river flow and river temperatures. Is there anticipated that we will also be using other indicia of global change or climate change within that? Are there any are the indicia being developed at the mouth or further into the ocean or other places that, and particularly I'm also curious about whether there are any indicia you're looking at in there with respect to cumulative impacts and the complexities associated with that?
Sure. First of all, the ability to calculate anything called a dB in the first place kind of requires two watches, if you like. In other words, you have to have two measurements to understand whether there's, in this case, in a sort of a context, whether there's a loss between them, right? So the ability to move out, say from the Fraser River out into the ocean, would be influenced by the ability to have a tool that told you something about whether there was a loss between the marine areas and, say, the mouth of the Fraser. And we do, of course, have our test fishing tools, but we haven't talked too much about trying to use those to develop sort of a equivalent concept to the DBE for the marine component of the migration, at least till they get to the coast.
I'm following you.
That's the first part. I'm going to lose my train of thought, so I may need to have you help me out. The other indices.
Cumulative impact
Cumulative
indices?
impacts. We've talked, the folks that are most involved with DBEs on the environmental side are folks in the DFO's Environmental Watch Program, and you're going to have David Patterson here soon to talk about that. And David probably can do a better job than I can, but I'll just go briefly. We have talked about different ways to account for the temperature effect. So things like accumulated degree days. So what I mean by that is like the temperature times the number of days that stock might be in the river. So we're using an average temperature now. Maybe it's better to think about the cumulative temperature experience over that fish's life in the river as a better predictor. You know, those kinds of issues are things that we've talked about. Is what's the best way to capture the environmental impact on the fish in terms of an index? Some constraints that we have relate to the in-season period, and that we need something that we can have in our hands at the time in a timely enough way that it influences decisions. So what I mean by that is, if in an ideal world, if we knew the temperature that the stock was exposed to over its entire 30-day duration in the river, that would be a way better predictor. But by the time we had that piece of data in season, those fish would have been, they'd be on the spawning grounds, you know. So we have to make, you know, we are making decisions. I don't say we have to make decisions. Currently, we are making decisions significantly sooner than when the fish has experienced its entire freshwater experience, right? They're made a lot sooner. So it's just to understand that there are predictors out there that might be much better, but we might not have them in a timely enough way to be useful in our current timeliness of our decision making that we have right now.
Primarily because the largest access to those fisheries is the marine.
It varies by year. I mean, I'm sure that you guys have gone through.
But that's the pressure. The pressure is that you're in.
I wouldn't characterize it as pressure. I would characterize it as a reality of the way the allocation is currently set up. It's not.
That's fine. That's sufficient on that. Just a couple more questions on the kind of indicia. Would it be useful to have health abundance and genetic diversity going up through the main stock of the Fraser and all the way up to the spawning grounds? Health
indices are another one of those things that we're talking about. I think David can speak to this more because he's done a lot of work in that area. David Patterson.
Okay. I just want to pause primarily because I found your observations on the Bristol Bay comparisons are quite useful, in particular that we only have one mouth in the Fraser and one main mouth. Cumulative and growing impacts of urbanization at the mouth of the Fraser must be something of interest to to your work. Is that correct?
Not directly, because I'm not involved with that directly, but certainly folks who are involved on the habitat side within the DFO would certainly be very interested in that.
And again, given the need to develop indicia for impacts, that would be an area that would be useful to have for you when developing these numbers. Is that correct?
I believe it would be helpful, yes.
Thank you. One final thing on you made a couple of comments on gear types and the impacts of gear types, particularly in warm temperatures. Am I right to hear that right, that we're talking about gear types in the river, and that would probably be the significant impacts of the gill nets throughout the Fraser stem and further? And
yeah.
let me just go one step further and perhaps just ask my question, which is, do you see that impact could be lessened if we began to look at some of the selective methods that have been traditionally used at the mouth and going through the Fraser, in particular the seines, the beach seines and the weirs and the fish wheels and the tidal traps?
Short answer is yes.
I do have more questions, Mr. Commissioner. I am over my time, and I will apologize to all the council in the room as soon as we're finished. But is this a convenient time to break?
I can accept some responsibility for that.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.